I'm Betta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about nuclear weapons. And it's not anybody's favorite topic, but it sure is a topic that we shouldn't drop because we're back into it again. If there's not an arms race going on now, I don't know what that you'd call it, because we're back into everybody's got to get their own nuclear weapons if they want to feel secure, which doesn't make me feel secure. But I have three folks here who are experienced diplomats who've addressed or are still working on the diplomacy involved in trying to get nuclear disarmament. And so we're going to have an informal conversation. Two of them know each other. The third one, Earl Turcotte, is somebody I've known a long time, but so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Earl and hope that and ask the other two people who know each other to take turns introducing each other. All right. And Earl Turcotte is a fellow who worked with the Canadian International Development Agency for 22 years. And he has also worked several years in something called Mine Action, which I think is a team at the Department of Foreign Affairs. I think he was working on that for 7 years. And one of the important things he did was to advise the government of Laos, because they have a program. I've heard him tell about this. It'll really, really curl your hair to hear about the unexploded ordnance from the Vietnam War that still contaminates about a third of Laos. But we won't talk about that today. We'll be talking about nuclear weapons. And he is now working as the chair of the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which is a group of 17 non-governmental organizations. So this is Earl. Hi, Earl. Good morning.
Hello, Metta. Happy to be with you.
And I'm going to ask Tariq Ralph, who is, believe it or not, in Vienna. He's pretending to be on a South Sea island but I've had that same green screen behind people in Russia. People all over the world are pretending to be in that very same spot that you're in, Tariq. And it does look heavenly. Anyway, I believe you're in Vienna, and I'm going to ask you to introduce Rabia. And then I'm going to ask Rabia to introduce you, because you know each other. And instead of my trying to memorize something, I'll just say you tell each other secrets if you want to. So tell us who this lady is, Rabia Akhtar.
Well, good afternoon from Vienna. And yes, I have a virtual background behind me, and that's because we are talking about issues that potentially concern ending life on Earth, that is nuclear weapons. So I thought we should have a much more positive background. So I'm very pleased to introduce Rabia Akhtar. She's currently a visiting fellow with the Managing the Atom project at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Rabia, in my view, is one of the foremost and leading educators in Pakistan on nuclear weapons and international and regional security issues. She is the Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences and a Professor of International Relations, and also the founding director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Policy Research, and also of the School of Integrated Social Sciences at the University of Lahore. She has been very active in working on regional security, in particular regarding South Asia. She wrote a book which is called The Blind Eye, which is a U.S. non-proliferation policy towards Pakistan from Ford to Clinton. And I wish she might consider writing another book called Eyes Wide Shut, U.S. non-proliferation policy from President Bush to President Trump. So with that, I will pass the microphone over to Rabia.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for such a generous introduction. Thank you, Meta, for having me here. I think Tariq Rauf, for this audience who will be tuning in for your show, is not a new name. Tariq Rauf is a distinguished and globally respected authority on nuclear disarmament and verification, whose pioneering work at the IAEA and SIPRI has shaped the architecture of international nuclear governance for over 3 decades, and we all have benefited immensely from, his wisdom. He regularly trains diplomats, civil society leaders through UNITAR, and continues to brief international missions on nuclear governance, safeguards, and disarmament issues. So it's a pleasure to be here in the company of Tariq Rauf, Earl, and yourself, Meta. Thank you.
So you've all had some experience or some thoughts. Are we ever going to get rid of the damn things? And if so, what are the most promising approaches would you have? I know that Tariq has just come back from New York, having attended the non-proliferation meetings, which, as I was saying to him, I've received almost no comments about this time. It's as if it's not even news. People go and they go home and they don't even talk about it, that's not a good sign.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Rabia for a very generous introduction. So as Meta said, I was at the third session of the Preparatory Committee meeting for next year's Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. This meeting lasted for 2 weeks from the end of April to the beginning of May. Rabia Akhtar was also there attending a civil society event, and I hope she will mention something about that. So again, here, the main divide was between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states in a general sense. There was a general sense of frustration that we had not achieved nuclear disarmament to the extent that was expected when the Non-Proliferation Treaty came into force in 1970, 55 years ago. We still today have more than 12,000 nuclear weapons at 108 locations in 15 countries. Now, of these 15 countries, 9 are nuclear armed countries, and then 6 are non-nuclear armed countries which host nuclear weapons on their territory. So we have a treaty called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that was championed by many non-nuclear weapon states, that was signed in 2017 and it entered into force in 2021. But unfortunately, none of the 9 nuclear armed countries have signed it. They oppose it bitterly. And many countries, including Canada, which rely on extended deterrence, that is, US defense arrangements underpinned by nuclear weapons, they also oppose this and consider this as a threat to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So with that introduction, I'll ask either Rabia or Earl to come in.
Well, first, though, I'd like to know, you were there to do some preparation for another meeting, right? And I don't know what you do when you're trying, what is involved in a PrepCom?
Okay, so for the mandate for this particular PrepCom was, 1, to come up with recommendations on specific action items relating to nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, including verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and on various aspects of cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, this last issue can be controversial in some circles, as some countries and some people in the civil society community consider that nuclear energy contributes to nuclear weapons. I personally would disagree with that. But nuclear energy is now recognized as being key to meeting sustainable development goals, to keeping climate change below 1.5 degrees of warming. And so this would be an added contributor to renewable sources like solar and wind. So for the foreseeable future, nuclear energy will continue to play an important role. With regard to nuclear weapons, now the main discussion, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the continuing war, the worry is that 4 of the 9 nuclear armed states are involved in war. So Russia in Ukraine, Israel in the Middle East, and until recently, India and Pakistan. And I look forward to hearing Rabia's views on that because she wrote a piece for the Belfare Center on this.
Yes, I also had an opportunity to speak at the NPT PrepCom at a side event that was hosted by Nuclear Threat Initiative. And it was about how can we safeguard nuclear facilities in conflict zones. And so, South Asia perhaps is the only example where India and Pakistan signed a non-attack agreement on each other's nuclear facilities back in 1988. And this agreement has held the test of time for the past 33 years or so, and has also stood, the test of time through all of the crises that India and Pakistan have had with each other. The idea, back then, and even all these years over a period of decades, even post-nuclearization, has been very simple. That in a region as volatile as South Asia, we need a commitment from these two nuclear-armed neighbors that will not target each other's critical infrastructure, especially when it includes our nuclear facilities, even in the times of crisis. And you have seen that, if you've been following this current crisis between India and Pakistan, that this agreement has held its ground, but whether it will continue to hold if there are several subsequent rounds of escalation, that is up for scrutiny. The current crisis, I'd like to say that has shown us that nuclear deterrence is not the same as nuclear stability. While the missiles, have crossed the international borders and perception warfare has replaced responsible signaling, our region has moved dangerously close to the edge. So risk reduction can no longer be postponed or outsourced. I say outsourced because for the longest time in South Asia, both India and Pakistan have outsourced escalation control to third parties, where they've thought that, whenever they will get into a crisis situation, third parties like US, China, UAE, Saudi Arabia will have enough stakes in stability in our region where they will come in and pull both India and Pakistan apart. And this is exactly what happened when you saw that this was a US brokered ceasefire that pulled India and Pakistan from the second round of escalation. So I believe that South Asia needs credible crisis communication mechanisms. It needs restated, very clear red lines. And the non-attack agreement has held so far, but any miscalculation is now one false narrative away.
If I understand you, I didn't know this, you just told me something, that they've promised not to hit each other's nuclear arsenals. If they get into a fight, they'll hit something else, maybe their cities or something like that. So at least not each other's basic weapons. So that's nice to know. But excuse me, I understand that if they do get to fighting over cities, that's the thing that's going to affect the rest of the world most because of this nuclear winter phenomenon. So I've often wondered whether the generals and the people controlling the nuclear weapons in both India and Pakistan are really mindful of the potential for catastrophe from the burning of cities. Can you speak to that, if you don't mind, Rabia?
Absolutely. So there is a bit of a difference. You said nuclear arsenals, and I said nuclear facilities. So the agreement does not talk about non-attack on command and control centers. It talks about nuclear facilities, which are commercial civilian research facilities, or any storage sites that have radioactive materials and such. So the article very clearly, states that, because if you say that you won't hit each other's command and control centers, that dilutes your deterrence. So they didn't go there. But the problem with South Asia is contiguity. They're both nuclear armed states, like they're close hostile border, the missile flying time is as again must have witnessed, is less than 2 to 3 minutes, and escalation is pretty rapid. But the problem with the terminologies that we have picked up from the Western literature on nuclear deterrence, like counterforce and countervalue, in my opinion, do not hold in our region because of the contiguous nature and close proximity, compressed times. When Soviet Union and United States were, in a Cold War situation with each other, they came up with all these terminologies because they were continents apart. When they talked about using nuclear weapons in a limited scenario, their battlefield was far removed, from each other's, lands. But in India and Pakistan's case, that is not as such. So counterforce, where you would, retaliate against military targets, is not as clearly alienated space where there will not be counter-value collateral damage. So that nuance, I think, must be kept in mind.
What about this nuclear winter thing, though? That's the thing that gives me nightmares.
Absolutely. There is a great deal of research out there which suggests that if India and Pakistan, use nuclear weapons, and it doesn't need to be hundreds of nuclear weapons, it just needs to be a couple of them. And that would create a nuclear winter, which is going to have global consequences, not only on, the environmental damage that it will have, but also crop production, agricultural and so on and so forth. There is a bit of awareness that think tanks and academic circles continue to bring it up, but as you must have witnessed, this region is pretty emotional. The public on both sides are pretty emotional, and no matter how much nuance you want to bring to the conversation that nuclear weapons are not to be used, if you follow the Twitter or social media timelines, you will see that both sides have used nuclear weapons on each other already on the social media feeds, and Indians especially are calling for total annihilation of the Pakistanis. And it's such a distorted space that, you cannot spend more than 1 minute, but thinking that this distortion, information warfare, disinformation, fake news has absolute escalatory potential. And this crisis has shown us exactly that.
Rabia was referring to is the non-attack agreement on civilian facilities. These are the two only nuclear-armed countries that exchange a list of civilian facilities on the 1st of January every year, and they did so this year as well. Now, with regard to crazy generals in India and Pakistan, I don't think they're any crazier than the generals or admirals in other nuclear-armed countries. A couple of years ago, Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation did a public survey, and 79% of Americans supported U.S. use of nuclear weapons under certain circumstances. So I am very resistant to isolating South Asia as being something more crazy than anyone else. And the daily deterrence between the Russians and the Americans is posited on attacking targets that will involve massive casualties in cities. This is generally referred as a euphemism as collateral damage.
Meta, as you pointed out at the beginning, all my professional experience actually was mostly in international development, but for the last 15 years of my working life, it was in arms control and disarmament, but with respect to conventional weapons. So I do not consider myself to be an expert on nuclear disarmament. That said, for the last 10 years, I have volunteered my time with various organizations, and most recently with the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. So I'm going to give you my generalist's impression, not an expert opinion by any means. I'm so happy that Rabia and Tariqa pointed out sort of the terrible state of affairs that we are in, not just with respect to global tensions, but diplomatically. Being at such an impasse globally with respect to any meaningful moves towards nuclear disarmament. Now, there's a false impression out there, I find, with some people when they consider the risks that are posed by nuclear weapons. And the false impression is that we're making great strides in nuclear disarmament because at the height of the Cold War, I gather, there were approximately 70, now Tariq, please correct me, or Rabia if I'm wrong, but my understanding is roughly 77,000 nuclear weapons. And through various, usually bilateral treaties between the US and Russia, and in many cases, unilateral action by nuclear armed states, that number came down to, as Tariq said, roughly 12,000 nuclear weapons. Now, that doesn't tell the tale of what is really happening for a number of reasons. One is these 12,000 weapons, as I understand it, are exponentially more dangerous, with the exception of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, than the small atomic weapons that nonetheless unleashed horror on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Many have multiple warheads, so the numbers have to be seriously considered. But clearly, 9 nuclear armed states and have more than enough nuclear weaponry to destroy the world many, many times.
Errol, this 12,000, does that include, is that counting the tactical weapons that are really, if anybody's going to use anything in Europe, it would be Ukraine and Russia using tactical weapons, which are small meaning like Hiroshima size. This 12,000 counts those or not? Is that something separate?
No, that's my understanding, but I defer to Tariq and Rabia, who would probably know more precisely.
I think we should refer to these as 12,000 nuclear warheads, not weapons, which is a more correct term. And what Earl was saying was absolutely right. So, Earl, please continue.
Okay, thank you. And, we look at the situation. I mean, the tension between India and Pakistan is terribly worrisome. But what is happening elsewhere is incredibly worrisome as well. Now, we have a president of the United States who not that many years ago threatened fire and fury against another nuclear armed state, North Korea. We have Vladimir Putin in Russia, who has lowered the threshold, and actually the US as well have lowered their respective thresholds for the first use of nuclear weapons. And again, without others can correct me on the details, my understanding is that it is no longer simply considered to be defensive to counter a nuclear attack on their respective states. There are conditions, certainly in Russia, they've been very clear about this, where if they consider that there is a significant threat to their national security, even with conventional means, they will consider resorting to nuclear weapons. Generals in the United States have talked about using nuclear weapons to actually win a war, if you can believe that. And I think even the average person knows that there's no such thing as winning a nuclear war, because chances are the next nuclear event, whether it is a deliberate attack or whether it's the result of miscalculation or technical error or accident, could spiral into an all-out nuclear exchange. And just recently, I was informed that I think fairly recent research is that less than 3% of the current number of nuclear warheads, if they were to be detonated, would create a nuclear winter that would last approximately 10 years, wipe out roughly 1/3 of humanity, and of course, a wider exchange of nuclear weapons could end life on Earth as we know it, if not completely. So, things are tense. We have nuclear armed states that are now speaking openly and threatening to use nuclear weapons. Again, getting back to Russia, they have threatened to use it if third parties intervene directly in their war with Ukraine. So the world is potentially on the brink. Not to be alarmist, but as somebody else once said very recently, you're not being alarmist if there is genuine cause for alarm.
I'd like to know where the cutting edge is. What is the area in which there might be progress, or Rabia, you're at the Belfer Center in this institute where everybody's talking about nuclear weapons day in and down night. But when you get into an argument, what do you argue about? What is the issue that might make a difference if we could settle it? And I think that probably everything that Earl has said, we would agree is factually correct. Maybe not, but to be scared is only to be realistic. But if you're talking about how we might get a breakthrough and get any kind of solution, what do you think about and discuss at this Managing the Atom project?
So, as you know, thank you so much, Earl, for your great comments and saying that this is not alarmism because the world is facing, these inflection points, I guess. What we discuss here mostly is U.S. and China global power competition. And here comes a crisis in South Asia, which has pulled the U.S. back into the conversation to, pull both India and Pakistan apart. But all of this that has happened, in South Asia has not happened in a vacuum. I think any conversation, broader conversation about South Asia and the crisis, Kashmir, which is an unresolved conflict, is at the heart of it. And it continues to produce these crisis triggers where, as long as Kashmir remains contested and militarized, I think South Asia's crisis loop will stay active and it will bring back the great powers as back channel mediators or pulling both India and Pakistan apart. So here the conversation largely has been about great power competition and as to how US and China need to manage various zones of influences across. I think for nuclear risk reduction, Russia and Ukraine triggered that conversation once again. And I believe that now South Asia with this current crisis, is right at the heart of it to bring all of these, conversations back to the forefront. We have seen that despite intense escalation, India and Pakistan did not go to war, but they came actually very, very dangerously close to it. But that doesn't mean that, we think that the region is stable. It is not. The current crisis has shown that deterrence is not the same as nuclear stability. So we need to have more conversation about it. We have witnessed a troubling shift. Escalation is climbing, but restraint is improvised. And this current crisis tells us that nuclear risk reduction needs to be institutionalized through real-time communication channels between the two countries, renewed confidence-building measures, even though they have a lot of them between them, political agreements, solution of Kashmir. All of this is to bring both of these countries, back from the brink, and when they are dangerously close to catastrophe. In South Asia, we are not short on deterrence. We are, I think, short on discipline. And these nuclear weapons may deter a total war, but they do not prevent misinterpretation, disinformation, domestic political overreach. So true risk reduction, I think, begins when both India and Pakistan will stop performing crisis management and start building it institutionally before the next crisis leaves no room for diplomacy. So I think the conversation back here is also about nuclear risk reduction and how can we learn from this crisis what needs to be done.
So in one sense, we can see that in the case of India and Pakistan, nuclear weapons to a certain extent have provided space for limited conventional conflict. This is the offshoot from the two nuclear superpowers who didn't fight a war directly between the Soviet Union and the United States, but they fought proxy wars in Asia, in Africa. So here the situation is different, as Rabia pointed out, but it's also a bigger picture than just South Asia. So India is now being recruited, so to speak, in the Quad, which is a new arrangement some years back, which is Japan, India, the United States, and I forget the fourth country, Rabia can fill in on that, to counter China. And so, as the US modernizes its nuclear arsenal, and President Trump has just signed off on a $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization, this will spur a buildup by China. Already, the US is charging that China will be building up to 1,000 nuclear warheads by the end of this particular decade, that is 2030. So, as China builds up, India also feels that it needs to build up because it also has an unresolved border conflict with China over the Himalayas. And when India builds up its nuclear forces, for Pakistan, it creates a vacuum of insecurity, so they also need to build up. So this has become a vicious circle. So first of all, we need to have a resumed arms control process between the Russian Federation and the United States. We need to find a way to bring China to the table as well. And then, as Rabia very correctly is pointing out, to assist India and Pakistan in reducing their bilateral tensions so that it can reduce the risk of conflict and, in particular, utilization and reliance on nuclear weapons for so-called deterrence, so to speak. Both sides, over the past, since they nuclearized in 1998, seem to have settled into this pattern of fighting a conflict for 2 or 3 days, and as Rabia pointed out, then waiting for a rescuer from outside to put pressure on the two sides to back down. And it also provides a face saver for both of these two countries to back down. And so risk reduction is one element, but I'm not sure whether this is sufficient. We need a broader framework.
Thank you, Tariq. So Quad is India, Japan, Australia, and US.
Yeah.
But, I'd like to bring to your notice the second order effects of the great power competition that are happening in South Asia. And that's actually what my research project here at Belfer Center is as well. I'm looking at a nuclear tetraplex, which recognizes the complex interplay between US, China, India, and Pakistan in shaping nuclear risk and stability in South Asia. And so something to which Tariq also alluded to, India's prepping up of US prepping up, India and India modernizing to check sort of assertiveness of China in the Indo-Pacific. The 2025 crisis, did not occur in a vacuum, and it was a byproduct of accumulated, pressures that are cascading down the strategic chain, whereby there is US and China great power competition, India receiving influences in the middle, and Pakistan being at the tail end of the strategic chain, receiving these second order effects with amplified security dilemma. And so we need to, ask ourselves that, the future ladder, is the logical endpoint of this nuclear tetraplex. US-China rivalry we've seen fuels India's technological leap as well as doctrinal evolution. India's shift pressures Pakistan into faster, wider-ranging deterrence signaling, and the strategic buffers it erodes between both states, in multi-domain terms now, as we have seen. So it is really dangerous as to how, with compression, simultaneity of this. Retaliation and elimination of the escalation pauses that existed between this traditional dyad, are eroding really fast. And I think US and China and other countries like Russia and many others who are part of the supply chain in which India and Pakistan are deeply integrated need to think about escalation control, which is no longer, according to my mind, is a bilateral issue.
When you talk about Pakistan being at the tail end of a chain of, hierarchy of prestige or power or something, what does that amount to? You just in your last sentence, you refer to supply chain. What actually empirically do the Pakistanis feel deprived of because of being at the tail end of this hierarchy, if I've understood you correctly?
Sure.
Yeah.
So just taking this current crisis as as an example to help you understand the effects of the strategic change, we have seen certain technologies that have made their debut in this crisis that were never used in war, in conflicts and crises between India and Pakistan ever since their nuclearization. We have seen India, employ its Akash missile system. There has been S-400s that it had received from India. It has employed its BrahMos cruise missile, and it has ISRO integration with the US. It has, integrated cyber defense operations. All of these it has received through its defense partnerships from the US and Russia and several other countries as well. Pakistan on its side, because of Indian conventional and nuclear modernization, had an amplified security dilemma because it has strategic parity on the top because it has nuclear weapons. So there's nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons parity. But in the conventional domain, it has a deficit because of the sheer size that India has. So it has been 1:10 ratio for everything that in Pakistan, India has 10, Pakistan has 1 off. But with its integration and interoperability with China, it has developed, some sort of parity in the conventional domain as well, where now strength of, let's say, for example, a squadron does not matter, but the quality of the weapons that it has employed. So in the technologies that have made a debut for Pakistan are the J-10C fighter jets that it acquired from China. It's a multi-role combat aircraft, and it engaged Indian aircrafts, especially the Rafale jets. You must have seen the news of Pakistan downing those high-tech jets with PL-15 missiles, which I didn't know were hypersonic missiles that Pakistan had, and it made its debut, which signals the operational integration of hypersonic class munitions into Pakistan's frontline strike platforms. So there is integration happening. US and China, providing these. And I have a theory, it's a working theory. It is not, something that is, I have yet to write about, but I do believe that, I do question myself, and I want others to question this as well, whether South Asia is going to become a proxy battleground for US-China's strategic technologies. India testing bed for integrated Western, source systems. Pakistan giving a live demonstration of China's modular combat model. There has been cyber and electronic warfare dimensions to this crisis. So this crisis, to me, reveals a proxy testing ground dynamic where each side was able to indirectly assess the performance as well as interoperability of their military platforms and technologies under real-world conflict conditions. You know that China has never fought a battle. It is their army, their armed forces are not battle-hardened. Where are they going to test? I'm not making this assertion that China is doing this deliberately. China and Pakistan have a strategic relationship that goes far back. But if some signal has to be made to the US that their technologies work, then where are they going to work? So there is a complex multi-domain. I'm not trying to simplify it because it's really complex. There is a multi-domain geopolitical landscape, where this long-standing conflict of Kashmir between India and Pakistan has now become a broader competition between global powers, particularly US and China. And this conflict, to me, has evolved into a testing ground of these new military technologies, doctrines, strategic influences, with the two countries serving as connected nodes in a larger global system. So you should not just look at South Asia as a traditional India-Pakistan diet when it is receiving influences from great power, rivalry, and competition.
Thank you.
Yeah, to add to that excellent survey by Rabia, so South Asia is a little bit late to this. So the nature of warfare is now changing. And we saw the first demonstration of this in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijan used Turkish drones. We in parlance say are UAVs unarmed vehicles or uncrewed vehicles, UCVs, to devastate Armenia's tanks and air defenses. And we see the same thing happening now in the war between Russia and Ukraine, where you have a whole bunch of systems provided by the United States, by France, by Germany, Netherlands, United Kingdom, which are also being tested in the war between Russia and Ukraine, Storm Shadows, Meteors, and others. So the India-Pakistan thing is the latest iteration of that. And as Rabia mentioned, it brings in a new actor, which in this case is China. And one of the reasons why China is now more involved is that traditionally the advanced weapons supplier for Pakistan has been the United States. And as Rabia pointed out, given the quantitative disadvantage for Pakistan, it has tried to equalize by having a technological edge. So the Pakistan Air Force has always tried to have an overmatch over the Indian Air Force. And even on the ground level, they have a sort of an overmatch because India has to split its conventional forces to also be able to fight a two-front war. And we saw that not only this time, but also 6 years ago in a previous confrontation where the Indian side came out on the deficit, so to speak. So Rabia is absolutely correct that now if South Asia becomes the new testing ground, this also validates concepts for a war over Taiwan, both for China and also for the United States. The loser in this is the Russian Federation because their weapons are now being phased out, and now it's basically a technological rivalry. And in some respects, some analysts claim that the Chinese are more advanced in some of these technology sectors than the US, so the US has to play catch up. On the other hand, the US still is an unmatched global power, particularly at the naval front. And while China might have the world's largest navy in terms of numbers of ships, they still cannot match the US carrier battle groups, the nuclear attack submarines, and the nuclear missile carrying submarines. So this is becoming a very complicated picture where South Asia is only one node, again, to support what Rabia just said. So I would like to bring in Earl, what are the possibilities for a new Canadian government to act as a middle power to try and resolve some of these tensions? Canada has a significant South Asian population. As you know, no Canadian government can win a majority if they don't win the South Asian vote in the Greater Toronto area and also in British Columbia. And Canada has deep roots to South Asia. And, the foreign minister is of Indian origin Canadian. The minister of the Treasury is a Pakistani origin Canadian. So we Canadians, we do have a role here in trying to stabilize South Asia. And I hope Prime Minister Carney doesn't arrive in New Delhi all dressed up in Indian clothes as Prime Minister Trudeau and his family did and made a spectacle of themselves.
Let's hope not, Tariq. Well, thanks very much. Listen, before I speak about Canada, and I'm happy to do that because there has been some very interesting developments, as you say, politically here. I'd like to just go back to where we started at the beginning of this conversation, and that is sort of on the diplomatic front, because I think we have to point out as well for people who may not know that while the nuclear powers are expanding and modernizing their nuclear weaponry, at the same time, the diplomatic architecture that hitherto has exercised some controls over the nuclear situation is gradually disintegrating. I mean, we've seen the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Program of Action rather, with Iran fall apart. I believe it was in 2018 that the U.S. withdrew. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty between the United States and Russia has fallen by the wayside. The Open Skies Treaty has fallen by the wayside. We have New START that is going to expire, the New Strategic Arms Trade Treaty in 2026. And right now, maybe depending on what happens in the conversation between President Trump and President Putin today, we'll see what the prospects are for the renewal of New START in 2026. But generally speaking, it's a terrible state of affairs with respect to nuclear powers themselves and the various treaties that have been controlling them. Now, first, a bit of good news before we move on to Canada. What many people may not be aware of is that 5 nuclear weapons-free zones have been established in different parts of the world. We've got in Latin America and the Caribbean was the first one, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central Asia, involving 138 countries of 193 UN member states. Now, that is a large percentage of the world's population that have already declared themselves nuclear weapons-free zones. And in Canada, for example, we had a national survey done in 2021 that indicated that more than 80% of Canadians thought that nuclear weapons present an existential threat, and that the government of Canada can play a useful role in trying to advance nuclear disarmament. Now, I think Canada is very much representative of the populations in most countries around the world. Even in nuclear-armed states, I think the majority of the population, perhaps with 1 or 2 exceptions, would support nuclear disarmament. So there is a large mass of support for nuclear disarmament. And if we can talk about ways to mobilize that support among the public and among like-minded governments to put pressure on not just the 9 nuclear-armed states, but the umbrella states, some call them enabling states, like our own as a member of NATO, that still subscribe to the nuclear security doctrine that NATO espouses, notwithstanding the fact that nuclear has declared that it does support the eventual goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons when conditions are right. The problem is they do not believe conditions are right, and I think we'd probably have to live in an ideal world before they would agree that conditions are right. So I think that it will not be the natural development or a state of affairs that motivates governments unto themselves to get rid of their nuclear weapons. It will only be as a result of pressure that is brought to bear by the rest of the world, or, heaven forbid, a nuclear event that finally drives home the point that this is a threat to humanity, and we simply can't risk it any further. If I could just briefly say a few words about Canada, because Tariq has opened the door for me. Now, this concerns the world, but Canada in the past has played, for a relatively small country in terms of power, large country geographically, but small in terms of power and population. We've played a pretty significant role in the past in diplomatic leadership. Many people know of the anti-personal mine ban treaty that Canada led, but Canada is also involved in the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and any number of diplomatic or many other diplomatic initiatives where we did play a little bit of an oversized role. Now, we have a new prime minister who has, I think for the first time since Trudeau the Elder, has a true worldview and understanding, and in fact, in many ways, a much more pragmatic, hands-on understanding of the levers of power globally, and not just in economics. And I think that he would be very well placed. Canada would be very well placed. We're the current president of the G7. We're a member of the Commonwealth, La Francophonie, and NATO. We believe in multilateralism and have worked positively in the past multilaterally. I think that our country, along with many other like-minded states, could bring pressure to bear, far greater pressure to bear on nuclear-armed states to move this file along. Civil society in Canada, we are organizing right now. A number of letters are being written to the new Prime Minister, urging him to do so. Demonstrations are being organized. We're thinking of any number of ways that we can raise the profile of the issue and try to motivate our government to do something, and hope that this Prime Minister is much more receptive on the nuclear disarmament file than our previous Prime Minister, who unfortunately was not.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Earl for his comments and something to which he said, God forbid that we enter a stage where nuclear weapon is used enough to make us realize. And I think India-Pakistan crisis confirms that what many of us have long argued, that there is no space for limited war in South Asia. What you saw in the past couple of weeks was not a war. It was a conflict which was limited in scope and missile strikes against each other. The sheer idea that conflicts between nuclear neighbors can be neatly packaged, they can be controlled, is bounded in illusion. The region lacks bilateral institutional back channels and mechanisms. There is lack of trust between the two countries to keep escalation in check. And if there are any key takeaways for an international audience, is that the region is sleepwalking into normalization of crisis-driven signaling. And this to me is not strategic maturity. It is systemic fragility, which is masked as control. We think we have control, but there cannot be a planned escalation control. We don't know where we are heading. Kashmir remains unresolved as the center of gravity. South Asia has entered through this crisis an era of multi-domain cross-border conflict where the line between conventional and strategic is increasingly blurred. There is narrative dominance as part of strategic warfare, denial, distortion of facts. They can hollow out the deterrence and invite further escalation. And a war, as a warning, between India and Pakistan must never be fought. With these two nuclear armed countries, that have been locked in decades long rivalry, even limited is a gamble with unthinkable consequences. So I think the world needs to stop treating each crisis as isolated. There is an arc that is moving, and it is moving in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Okay, historically, Russia, the Soviet Union, and the U.S. have owned between them, I think over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world, and the nuclear confrontation, the issues of nuclear negotiation have been almost exclusively bilateral. So the treaties many of them have been negotiated entirely between the U.S. and what was the Soviet Union or later. So now I see that this is quite different. If I'm not mistaken, must have been a year or two ago, in God knows what context, I believe Trump said, "Oh well, I won't go back to negotiating just with Russia, a bilateral agreement. Now it's time to bring at least China into the discussion." So I don't know I would like to ask whether or not any of you take that as a serious plan or an off-the-cuff speculation, or God knows what. The man says whatever pops into his head at any one moment. But is there any reason to think that this could be a real plan? I know he'd like to get a Nobel Peace Prize for something, so let's see if he'll do that to get rid of nuclear weapons with a conference among many states about real disarmament. Is that silly, or is there a real prospect that something like that might happen?
So, Meta, this issue about China is not new. Originally, it was President Putin who said that the next round of arms control negotiations with the U.S. must have China on the table. This was at the time when the relationship between China and the United States was warm, but not as warm as it is now. Then the position reversed. And then starting with President Obama himself, he also wanted to bring China to the table, as did President Biden during his term. But the Chinese are the most resistant to coming and joining the multilateral formats on nuclear disarmament. Their argument, which they were presenting in New York just a couple of weeks ago at this NPT Non-Proliferation Treaty meeting, was that the two largest arsenals must first come down to their level, that is the level of China, before China would be willing to join them. And by asking China to join the two in negotiations now, either on strategic stability, on risk reduction, or arms reductions, is putting China at a disadvantage. And this was one of the main areas of disagreement at this NPT meeting last couple of weeks, among others. So bringing China at the moment is an important issue. Then the Russians say, well, if you want to bring China in, we also want to bring in France and the United Kingdom, and then we are back to the same old thing of who comes first, who's at the table, and who's not. We, as Earl pointed out, the New START agreement, which is the only remaining arms control treaty between Washington and Moscow, will expire on the 5th of February. Both sides have suspended formal implementation, although informally they are abiding by the limits of 1,550 deployed warheads and 800 delivery systems, both deployed and non-deployed. But the 1,550 deployed warheads is sort of a misnomer, because given the counting rules, a strategic bomber that could carry up to 20 nuclear warheads is only counted as carrying one. And if New START expires and the two sides don't agree informally, which they can do very easily, to continue to abide by the numerical limits of New START while they come up with another arrangement or a treaty or an executive agreement, that would be very useful, because absent that, both countries can put more warheads on their existing missiles and bombers and nearly double the number of warheads that are available for ready use. And that is one of the biggest dangers. And a new concept that is now being promoted is called fail-safe, for the nuclear armed states to carry out internal reviews to ensure that procedures exist to guard against accidental, unauthorized use of nuclear or launch of nuclear weapons, or technical failures that could lead to false warnings, and also to guard against spoofing and hacking of their systems, to make sure that the fail mechanism is fail safe and not fail launch mechanism, to use a term. But this is the point that I was helping a particular delegation at this PrepCom, and I put it in their statement. But unfortunately, none of the nuclear weapon states followed up on this. So we need to continue to do a little bit more work. This is a little bit like the stress tests that were instituted after the Fukushima nuclear accident in March of 2011, where countries around the world, over 433 reactors producing nuclear energy, each went through stress tests that if they lose power or have an accident, the reactor will not melt down. So we need a similar mechanism to ensure that in these times of heightened tension, of lowered restraints on possible use of nuclear weapons, that the integrity of the command and control systems remains. And as more and more reliance is placed on IT and artificial intelligence, large language models, the role of the human being still needs to remain absolutely critical. And now there's a new book coming out tomorrow called Original Sin, which claims that President Biden, during most of his recent term, had cognitive deficiencies. And in the US system, it's the president who has sole command launch authority. That's not much different from some other countries. So this, again, is an important issue, which also falls under the fail-safe concept, is human control, and to ensure that the leaders of countries that are nuclear armed are cognitively here. They understand the risks of nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, in most of these 9 countries, the leaders controlling nuclear weapons are old men, and with all the attendant consequences.
Hey, boy, what we what an agenda. You've given us a lifetime list of things to pursue, and we have already exhausted all our time today. I don't know which of these you would put the highest priority on. If you had, just in one word, which of these, Tariq, if you had to bet on as a most useful intervention that could be made now that would improve our security globally, which one of these items that you mentioned would you give top priority to?
So I will duck the question and pass it over to my good friend Rabia to sign out this particular session.
Well, she was asking about your priority, Tariq.
Well, you can give your priorities.
So
Well, he gave a whole agenda, like 20 different items. So you get to pick which of his you'd pick.
Sure. I still think, coming out fresh from this crisis in South Asia, and because I look at these issues, the absence of crisis learning and repetition of patterns, to my mind, and lack of communication and understanding of each other's, signaling, misinterpretation of signaling, confusing the conventional with nuclear is the most concerning element for me. India and Pakistan are repeating their escalation patterns, but only this time at a higher rung of the ladder. And South Asia has moved forward in hardware, but it has moved backward in political restraint. And I think we are in dangerous waters. And I hope that strategic deterrence continues to hold, but it is constantly undermined by political signaling that seeks to project dominance rather than stability.
Well, I guess the only conclusion I can say is that bringing all of you wonderful people together leads to only one conclusion, one advice to the general audience, which is be afraid and do something, but we're not quite sure which of these things you can do most. I guess pay attention to what Earl is trying to do, because we citizens have some possible voice if we use them. And Earl is trying to corral us into putting pressure on our governments to do more. Earl, you have one word. I've got to tie this off.
Just to say, Meta, I think you're absolutely right. I think people around the world have to use whatever they can to pressure their governments to act. We're hopeful that Prime Minister Carney, as President of the G7, having a meeting coming up in Kananaskis, Alberta, in June, we would like to persuade him to bring nuclear disarmament to the fore, establish it as a foreign policy and defense priority, and begin to challenge the status quo in NATO, the nuclear security doctrine, and urge NATO to engage all nuclear armed states concurrently in a process of discussion that'll lead to negotiation and eventual total elimination of nuclear weapons.
Oh, this has been inspiring and discouraging all at the same time. And that's reality, isn't it? Thank you, guys, and carry on for what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meta.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.